Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for your time and for the opportunity. I am extremely honored and humbled to be here today to discuss some of my research on how extreme heat affects bees and blueberries. Before I get into the research, I want to spend just a little bit of time introducing myself. So I've lived in Michigan my whole life and have always dreamed of becoming an MSU Spartan. As a kid, I was always outside and loved every critter I came across, and it took me a long time to realize I could actually make a career playing outside, essentially, or learning about our natural world and protecting it for years to come. So I started as an undergraduate student here in 2015 and got a job as a student researcher in the entomology department. And I hadn't really considered working with insects before as my career, but very quickly fell in love with the work when I realized there were so many unknowns and things to uncover. So it really brought back all of those childhood curiosities. And I specifically really wanted to study bees and pollination systems because I began to understand how important these interactions are for the functioning of our planet and all of its inhabitants. I know how important bees are, and if I protect those bees and I protect those plants, I can also protect other things I love, whether it be animals, my community, or my family. So with that, I want to get into some of the motivation behind my research today. So looking at this graph here, we're looking at the historical records of temperature extremes in the United States from 1910 till now. And where you're seeing those red bars is indicating times where temperatures are much hotter than normal. And the taller those bars are, the more abnormal those extreme heat events are. So it's clear that extreme heat events are becoming much more intense, particularly in the last decade or so, but so too are the frequency and duration of these extreme heat events. And this isn't just happening across the US, it's even happening in our own backyard. So in 2018, Michigan blueberry growing regions experienced temperatures over 92 degrees Fahrenheit for several hours during its bloom period. This was the hottest year on record in the past 92 years, even hotter than temperatures recorded during the Dust Bowl. In that same year, blueberry growers reported 30 to 50% yield declines. This was millions of dollars lost for the industry, and it inhibited fresh local produce to Michigan consumers. However, no one really understood why this happened, why this yield loss occurred. So to understand this a little bit more, I want to break down the blueberry pollination process. So essentially, pollination is the process of moving pollen from one flower to another, and one of the best animals to help mediate this process are bees. There are over 20,000 different species of bees in the world, and most of them have formed very tight relationships with flowering plants. This is because bees get most of their food from flowers, and many flowers need help being fertilized. So what these bees do is they collect pollen and they deposit these pollen grains onto the stigma of a flower, which is one of the female floral organs. And if that pollen is viable, it will germinate and grow those pollen tubes up the style of the flower in order to reach the ovary. If it reaches the ovary and fertilizes that flower, it will produce a berry. And the better pollinated these flowers are, the bigger, sweeter, and more nutritious these berries are. So this process of animal-mediated pollination is a huge deal. In fact, about 75% of our world's crops requires animals, primarily bees, to aid in this pollination process in order to produce the food that we rely on. But in recent years, there have been shocking native bee population declines with worrying consequences for both agricultural production and the resilience of natural ecosystems. So how could extreme heat disrupt this pollination process? So what we did in our research, our first step was looking at how blueberry pollen responds to extreme heat. As I mentioned in that last slide, pollen needs to germinate and grow pollen tubes in order to reach the ovary to fertilize it to produce fruit. So in this graph here, what we're looking at is that pollen tubes, and we're seeing they get shorter as temperatures increase. This is potentially shedding light on some of these yield losses we saw in 2018, where maybe fertilization was limited in these flowers and could have led to fewer, smaller berries. But this is only a piece of this pollination puzzle. So how could this also be affecting bees? Well, we know that plants are producing pollen for their own reproduction, and these pollen grains contain nutrients like proteins, lipids, amino acids, and carbohydrates in order to fuel these reproductive processes, like pollen germination and pollen tube growth. At the same time, bees are also visiting flowers to consume this pollen to fulfill their own nutritional needs, as well as those of their offspring. Because like humans, bees need a healthy, balanced diet of proteins, lipids, etc. to develop and survive. So what we've hypothesized in our research is essentially that when these blueberry pollen grains are exposed to extreme heat, they may be lacking in some of these nutrients. If that's the case, then there could be repercussions not only on plant reproduction, but also their pollinators in terms of their development and survival. What we did in our research to understand this a bit more is we took flowering host plants, including blueberries, and we grew them in the MSU greenhouses until about early bloom. And then we exposed them to either normal or extreme heat temperatures. We then brought those plants into field cages at the MSU Entomology farm and released mason bees in these field cages. So mason bees are a bit different than honeybees, which is maybe a species you all are more familiar with. These are native solitary bee species, and the populations have been reported to be in decline around 60 to 90% in recent years. So what we did is we allowed these bees to fly on these flowers, collect pollen, and I spent a lot of time on that graphic. We allowed them to collect pollen from these flowers, and we recorded things about their behavior and egg laying. And once they had laid those eggs in the field, we would go in to collect them at night, bring them back to the lab to allow those eggs to hatch, consume that pollen that those female bees collected and provided to those eggs, and then we measured their development and survival throughout their adulthood. And our findings from this research was extremely stark and clear. What we found was that heat stress host plants indirectly has negative repercussions for these bee pollinators at multiple different life stages as well, as eggs, larvae, and as adults. Specifically, what we found is that these female mason bees, who we provided heat stress host plants, produce about 70% fewer eggs. And of those eggs that consumed that heat stress pollen, 60% of them died before ever reaching adulthood. The few bees that did survive into adulthood took about 3 days longer to emerge and died 3 days sooner, which is actually a substantial amount of time considering the fact that these bees only live for about 20 to 30 days in the season and could potentially miss the bloom time for many important crops, including blueberry, cherry, apple, etc. So this novel research done here at MSU provides a few important conclusions. First, we now know that extreme heat has negative repercussions on blueberry pollen viability, which again could be potentially affecting the yield loss we saw in 2018. Second, we also now know that exposure to extreme heat, even for just 4 hours, is enough to affect native bee development and survival. And together, these findings suggest cascading interactive negative effects of extreme heat on wild bee populations, the pollination services they provide, and the crop yields. So this research could not have been done without the expertise, support, and guidance of so many Spartans, including those at our MSU facilities and our MSU collaborators across many different disciplines. I also want to thank my advisor, Dr. Rufus Isaacs, who's also here today, and my entire lab group for all of their support and guidance. And I also want to specifically highlight the undergraduate students that helped make this research possible. They collected data, took care of plants and insects, and were central to the success of my research, but really any research group. And with that, for the time I have left today, I want to highlight the Entomology Research and Outreach Fellowship. So this is a program I helped co-create along with other graduate students in 2020, where we provide students research experience, particularly those that have come from historically excluded groups or have limited access to opportunities. We provide these students a livable wage, one-on-one mentorship, health insurance, and hands-on experience doing research here at MSU. So far, we have supported 12 students, and we just hired 3 more students this year, which is great. But this is a grassroots program. It's run entirely on donations and grants. And so if you're interested in learning more about the program, we listed our website on this slide here, and then we also provide a QR code in case you're interested in donating to the program. And with that, again, I want to thank you all so much for the opportunity and for your time. And for any time I've left, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Question. And I can go first if there's not a question. But I'm curious,
Yeah.
and I love the work that you're conducting there.
Thanks.
Any estimates on the financial potential financial impact of this research, either here locally in Michigan or across the country? Have you had a chance to look at that?
Yeah, so in that year of 2018, I believe with the yield reductions we saw, it was around $3 million that was lost in terms of that production. And every year since then, 2022 was also a massive loss that year, again, following another extreme heat wave that happened in May. So it's definitely something that is having economic impact and reducing that local produce to our Michigan communities.
And I also have to ask, I've learned this. I'm getting better at this.
Yeah.
Where are the best blueberry farms?
Yeah, so if you look this way,
And you-
Michigan blueberry countries so we use the lake effect. Blueberries need cooling in order to develop properly, and so we grow them along the coast of Lake Michigan, so they have this snow cover to help protect them, because these are plants that need cold temperatures, which is why part of the reason when we're seeing these extreme heat events in the spring that are very abnormal, we're seeing these negative consequences.
I just wanted to tell you this was a very fascinating presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you for your research. Thank you for starting this fellowship to help others that come behind you.
Absolutely.
To continue to do this great work. I have a severe bee allergy, but today I am thankful for the bees because I love blueberries.
Right.
Exactly.
Yes.
So I just, when we think of nature, we don't necessarily always appreciate how the climate affects bees. I'm worried about the polar bears, and I should be worried about the bees in our state. So I appreciate the knowledge that you're giving us and the work that you're doing, and hopefully we're going to eradicate these problems so we can continue to eat these wonderful West Michigan blueberries for many years to come. So
Thank you so much. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Other questions? Okay.
Thank you all again.
Jenna, thank you.